Good evening. I'm Matt Green, head of school at Falmouth Academy, and I'm delighted to introduce you to the second installation of our community series, sponsored in part by the Woods Hole Foundation. We're in for a treat this evening. Our guest tonight is someone with deep roots in the town of Falmouth and even deeper roots here at Falmouth Academy. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Ted Melillo, Falmouth Academy class of 1992. Ted's here to talk with us this evening about his new book, The Butterfly Effect. And having previewed the show, I think you'll find that Ted has a knack for making the rather obscure world of insects incredibly interesting and fascinating, at least to this old English teacher. Stick around after the show. The first segment is Ted's presentation, and will be followed by a question and answer period moderated by our own Science Department Chair, Liz Klein. Thanks for being here this evening, and thanks for everything you do to support Falmouth Academy.
Hello, everyone. This is Ted Melillo. I'm a proud Falmouth Academy graduate from the class of 1992. I am currently a professor of history and environmental studies at Amherst College, and today I'm going to be telling you a bit about my new book, The Butterfly Effect: Insects and the Making of the Modern World, which has just come out from Penguin Random House. The book is about the centrality of insects and insect bodies to so many of the things we think of as resolutely modern. I'm going to give you a little bit of background to get us started here. I'm going to talk about what are insects, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Insects have a three-part body plan: a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. They all have antennae, compound eyes, 3 pairs of jointed legs, so they're all 6-legged, 2 pairs of wings. You may think that spiders are insects, but they're not. They're arachnids. They're part of the larger group of animals known as arthropods, which also includes crustaceans, but they are not insects. Insects have been on Earth for a long time. They evolved approximately 480 million years ago. And I'm showing you an image here of the largest insects to have ruled Earth's prehistoric skies. There are these dragonfly-like bugs known as griffin flies, Meganeuromonyi, and they had 2 to 3 foot wingspans. So just imagine insects the size of small hawks. With their spiny front talons, they must have been an intimidating sight in prehistoric skies. Entomologists now estimate that there are 10 quintillion, that's 10 followed by 18 zeros, individual insects alive at any moment on our planet. And in recent years, scientists have accepted a mean estimate of 5.5 million insect species. So we're really living on an insect-dominated Earth. Insects can dwell almost anywhere, with the exception of the oceans. This is the vacuum bug, which is a flightless insect that inhabits the summit of Mauna Kea in Hawaii at over 12,800 feet. It's got an antifreeze-like substance in its body that allows it to absorb heat, and it dines on the leftovers of creatures that are blown to the icy summit and die a frozen death there. And then conversely, in the Sahara Desert, we've got the Sahara Desert ant, which can sustain a body temperature well above 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Surface temperatures there can reach 178 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, when you think of insects, what may come to mind is something like this image from the December 1930 issue of Modern Mechanics magazine. Insects have gotten a bad rap for good reason. They're the harbingers of plagues and diseases such as malaria, Zika, yellow fever, dengue fever, have been awful for humanity throughout much of history. And farmers spend something on the order of $16 billion a year around the world trying to eradicate insect pests. But as I found when I started to do the research for this project, there's another story to be told here. And it's about the beneficial impacts that insects have had on humanity and the ways that our species have learned to coexist and actually have ended up being mutually dependent. I'm going to start off by talking about 3 characters who often are not shown on the same image here. Ella Fitzgerald, America's First Lady of Song. The Ottoman Sultan, Abdülmecid I, who ruled the Ottoman Empire during the middle of the 19th century. And then a third image here of Brigadier General Charles O'Hara surrendering Lord Cornwallis's sword at Yorktown, Virginia in 1781. It's hard to imagine a trio of more incongruous individuals. I'll show you three objects that are related to these individuals, however, and then make some sense of why I've created this trio. Here's a picture of Ella Fitzgerald's record from November 1944, released by the Decca Company. It featured the hit Into Each Life, Some Rain Must Fall, which skyrocketed to #1 on the Billboard charts. The second image I'll show you is of one of the carpets in Abdülmecid I's palace, which was produced at the Imperial Factory at Hereke. And then lastly, I'm going to show you Brigadier General Charles O'Hara's red coat. You might think, what's he doing with these three images? They're actually images of things that were all produced from insect secretions. The 78 RPM record that featured Ella Fitzgerald's music was made largely of shellac, a secretion of the Karyalaka bug that's grown on fig and acacia trees in India and throughout much of Southeast Asia. The silk in Abdülmecid I's carpets was woven from the threads spun by Bombyx mori, the silkworm, and the red dye in the officer's coat shown at the bottom here was produced by crushing the female bodies of the cochineal bug, Dactylopus coccus. So all three of these objects are actually the products of insect bodies. Now here are the stars of the show in some ways. This is the Karyalaka bug, the silkworm, and the cochineal bug, and they are indeed true bugs that share a number of features in both the cases of the Karyalaka bug and the cochineal bug. I'll talk about that later if I have a chance. I want to start out with shellac, though, and give you a sense of where it comes from. It's secreted by the females of the species, and they produce it to protect their young. After laying eggs, she will produce this resinous substance on fig and acacia tree branches, and then men and women, millions of them in fact, will gather this stuff, melt it down, turn it into big sheets that almost look like translucent plastic, break it into shards, melt it down, and then sell it. And as I said, 78 RPM records, which were the major conduit for the global transmission of music before the advent of vinyl records in the 1940s, were made of shellac. Shellac was also the major constituent in daguerreotype cases. These are the first generation of photographs. They were one-offs, there was no negative, and so they had to be protected very carefully, and so each of the daguerreotypes was placed in a case like this, but the cases became collector's items in their own right. They were molded from this resinous insect compound, shellac, and you can see one of these black daguerreotype cases at the top of the image here. You may know shellac today from having finished your back porch or deck with it. And it's ubiquitous. It's part of our everyday lives, although people may not remark on that fact. It's also in a lot of daily products that you may not realize. If there actually is trick-or-treating during the pandemic, you should look at the boxes of candy that your children are getting, and you'll see an ingredient called confectioner's glaze. It's one of the many pseudonyms, the guises under which shellac hides. It's actually a perfectly safe product, and one of the things it does is it keeps food looking shiny, and it also keeps water in food. And so you'll find it in all sorts of everyday products. When you walk into a grocery store and look at those shiny apples, they are likely coated with shellac, and that's what makes them look so yummy. Nail polish is often shellac-based, as is much hairspray. Now here are images of men and women cutting shellac off of branches of fig and acacia trees in India, Thailand, and other parts of the world. Burma, Myanmar, is another place where shellac is produced. I'll talk next about silk. The production of silk is known as sericulture. And here's a great close-up shot of a silkworm. The silkworm is a remarkable creature. From its tiny egg that looks like about the size of the head of a pin, it will hatch and then expand its body size by 10,000 times in the short 4 to 6 week period where it's eating almost 10 times a day. And what it's dining on are usually white mulberry leaves. I'm showing you some white mulberry plants here. And here's one of my favorite images of a fully grown silkworm moth. It's very rare that we see these because often the silkworm cocoon gets dipped in boiling water to extract the thread, and that kills the moth before it can hatch. But if it does grow to full adult stature and get to hatch from the cocoon, this is what it looks like. And then here's an image of the pupa in the cocoon before hatching. Here's a man in Turkmenistan holding silkworm cocoons. And then I'm showing you here men reeling silk in 19th century Turkestan. The older man on the right is boiling the cocoons in a cauldron of hot water. And then the man on the left is reeling the thread. And a silkworm's thread, it's actually two filaments combined together, can stretch up to 3,000 feet, a single silk thread. Just to give you a sense of how long that is, that's the equivalent of 10 U.S. football fields in length. Contemporary silk production, and here's an image of silk production in Sichuan province in China, looks a lot like it did thousands of years ago. And in many ways, the production of all three commodities is very similar to the ways that it existed in the ancient world. Here's a woman with rugs from Turkey, silk rugs. I want to tell you a bit of a historical story about silk, one that I like very much that's in the book. This is the first Western encounter with silk, which occurred at the Battle of Carhae in 53 before the Common Era, and I've given you a map here to get you located. Right at the juncture of the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire, which is in northeast Persia, modern-day Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan, one of Rome's wealthiest men, Marcus Licinius Crassus, brought his 7 Roman legions to face off in battle against General Serena and the Parthian archers. The Parthians were far superior, in part because they had learned how to turn 180 degrees and fire shots from their bows while they were retreating. But they were also superior because of their possession of silk. Just imagine, it's a hot day in the desert, and over the dunes come the Parthians, and they unfurl dozens of long scarlet-colored silk banners. The Roman legions were paralyzed at the sight and stood still for a moment, long enough for the Parthian archers to pin them to the ground. And in the book, I talk about how this is really an insect encounter in world history. It's the first time Romans are seeing this shimmering substance that they later try to do anything they can to get their hands on. I'll move from silk next to cochineal. Cochineal is a fascinating insect. Again, the female does all the work, and she secretes a red pigment to protect her young from predators. This is a contemporary photograph of people raising cochineal in small baskets hung on the side of nopal cacti pads. And the female insects lay their eggs and then stick their proboscis into the nopal cacti and feed off of the sweet juice that they suck out of the plant. I'll show you a picture of what a dried female bug looks like. It takes 70,000 of these dried female insects to produce a 1-pound brick of the powdery red substance that was known as cochineal dye. And it was much sought after, dating way back to Peru's Paracas culture. Cochineal dyeing first arose in Peru and then moved northward to the place we now call Mexico. The Mayans and the Aztecs were experts at using cochineal to dye their clothing, these brilliant hues, scarlet red, deep purples. The Aztecs had inherited this insect cultivation technique from their Toltec predecessors, and we've got records of Aztec culture in the Codex Mendoza that show bags of cochineal being presented to Moctezuma II or Montezuma II as one form of tribute from the surrounding villages. Now, Europeans, once they started to get hold of cochineal, just couldn't get enough of it. And that's because of its fixative powers. It has enormous staying power in fabrics, so it won't wash out or fade very easily. And when you combine it with various metals known as mordants, you can get a whole range of hues shown here on this piece of cloth. Here's an image of an indigenous worker brushing cochineal insects off a nopal cactus. And you can see on the right here, the males of the species, which have wings, they essentially mate and then fly away. The females stay at home and do all the work, and they're the ones that secrete the dye. And then here's a picture of a contemporary cochineal farm in Oaxaca, Mexico. Bienvenidos, welcome to our farm, the natural colors of Oaxaca. Pase usted, please come in and join us here. And today, again, cochineal production looks a whole lot like it did in ancient times, a woman using a metate to release the carmine dye from the dried bodies of the female insects here. Now you may wonder, where does cochineal occur in our daily lives? Well, it's all over the place. It was in Starbucks strawberry frappuccinos until there was a big uproar over that. It's in fruit on the bottom yogurt, fake crab legs. Campari used it for a long time. Candies, Tropicana ruby red grapefruit juice, all get their deep red hue from the secretions of a dried insect body. And in ingredients lists, you'll find it as carmine, one of the many terms under which it masquerades. And I've taught many a class where I've had students come in early in the morning with an apple in one hand and a yogurt in the other, and I'll point out to them that they're actually consuming 2 insect products as part of their breakfast, and I'll get quizzical looks back from them. Now you may wonder, why in the world did these ancient products not disappear with the advent of synthetic chemicals that could potentially replace them? After the Second World War, there was much ado about the rise of the synthetic age, that laboratories were going to produce substitutes for all of these chemicals that we had previously depended upon nature to produce. And indeed, there were many chemicals that synthetic chemistry was able to generate. As it turns out, however, many of these substitutes for natural products were toxic to the human body or were structurally inadequate and could not achieve the properties of natural products. That's the case with silk. In the case of shellac and cochineal, they came back in part because the things that people had invented to substitute for those products turned out to be devastating carcinogens. So in the book, I talk about the disappearance and then the rise again of silk, shellac, and cochineal. In the second half of the book, which I call Hives of Modernity, I talk about the way insects inhabit many of the institutions that we think of as modern, and one of those is genetic science. As of 2018, there have been 8 Nobel Prizes awarded to 18 scientists for research involving this little bug, the common fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster, and much of the pioneering research was done quite nearby in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, by this man, Thomas Hunt Morgan. In the winters, he would work at his Columbia fly room, shown here with a bunch of overripe bananas, which are really all that Drosophila needs to exist day to day. But in the summers, Morgan and his wife Lillian would come to Woods Hole and would work at the Marine Biological Laboratory on their genetic experiments. Now, Lillian was an incredible entomologist in her own right, and she also did something that turned out to be really important in my life. She founded the Woods Hole Children's School of Science, where I happened to take a class on entomology as an 11-year-old. And I took a course from Becky Lash, the noted monarch butterfly expert. And Becky one day put a monarch butterfly on a wedge of ripe watermelon, and all the kids in that hot, steamy classroom on that summer afternoon were jealous of that butterfly as it stuck its proboscis into the fruit and took a long drink. And that was probably the first moment in my life when I began to identify with something that had previously seemed so foreign and distant from my everyday life. So that's kind of where it all began, and that's the connection to Morgan. I'll briefly tell you about two more entomologists whose stories I profile in the book and who became very important to me as I did the research for this project. The woman on the left is Maria Sibylla Merian, and she's really the great, I'll add a few more greats for good measure, great-great-grandmother of entomology. She should be more widely recognized than she is, but she's starting to get some of the accolades that she deserves, and I hope that my book goes some distance to help that out. She was a remarkable woman. She was born in Germany and lived in the Netherlands for most of her life. In 1699, she and her daughter Dorothea crossed a gangplank, boarded a ship, and sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to the Dutch colony of Suriname, which was an absolutely brutal slave colony for sugar production at the time. But the reason the Merians went, as two women traveling all by themselves, funded entirely by the sale of their own paintings, was to study animals in the Americas. And principally they were interested in insects. Maria and her daughter spent the next few years traveling by dugout canoe deep into the heart of Suriname, making absolutely beautiful paintings of anything and everything that they saw. And they returned to Europe and published their work in a remarkable book. If you ever get a chance to look at Merian's illustrations, they're stunning. They're featured in many museum collections. And it revolutionized entomology in Europe at the time for two reasons. Merian showed insects for the first time in their ecological context. Previously, it had been a tradition to show species bereft of any background, just on a white background. You may think of Albrecht Dürer's famous stag beetle from 1505, which is just a beetle on a blank white canvas. Merian flipped everything on its head and showed things in their environments, and this was a remarkable innovation in entomology and in ecology. She also did something else really important, which was to show the different parts of an insect's metamorphosis, its life cycle, in the same image. Previously, people had thought that eggs and larvae and pupa and adults were different organisms altogether, and Merian helped upend that. So she's a remarkable figure in the history of entomology, and I really had fun researching her story. The other person I want to talk briefly about is Charles Henry Turner, who was born in the 19th century, died in the early 20th century. He's the first African American to be published in the prestigious journal Science, and he was the first Black man to get a PhD in zoology from the University of Chicago. But because he was Black, he was unable to get a university job anywhere in the United States. And he ended up as a high school teacher without any advanced laboratory equipment, no graduate students or assistants to help him out. And he did some truly remarkable experiments on honeybees. He did them all in a park in St. Louis. And he ended his life as a high school teacher. He published quite extensively, and his work on honeybees is basically the source of much of our knowledge about how pollination works. And I'll talk about pollination a little bit more later, but it's just such an important process for the functioning of our biosphere and for everything we take for granted in our daily diets. On average, 1 in 3 bites of food that a human takes on the planet has been pollinated by an insect, and Turner was one of the pioneers in helping us understand how that process works. Also in the book, I talk about eating insects and the way that many billionaires are banking on insects being part of the future of food. Bill Gates, Biz Stone, the co-founder of Twitter, Mark Cuban, whom you may know from the show Shark Tank, who's a billionaire, have all been investing their money in insects as a future food source. And I'm showing you here something that you may not be aware of, but 2 billion people on the planet right now eat insects as a common part of their daily diet. And there are all sorts of varieties this practice takes. Here's a marketplace in Oaxaca, Mexico, where people are selling chapulines, which are fried grasshoppers. I've tasted them. They're absolutely delicious because they're covered in chilies and lime, and they kind of just taste like a corn chip. These are actually making inroads in the United States these days. At Safeco Field in Seattle, where the Mariners play, these are one of the many treats that you can buy at the concession stand, and they've sold several 100,000 servings of these in the last 2 years that they've been vended. So maybe they're making inroads in the United States. This one is probably less familiar to you, the mopane worm called Mopanis, which is a really important protein source for millions of people in various parts of southern Africa. Now, this one is one that my students are often eating, and unbeknownst to them, it contains insect protein, which is extremely efficient to make. These are exo bars, just one of the many varieties of food made from cricket meal powder. One morning I was teaching a lecture class and some of my football players walked in. They were all munching on these bars after their workouts. And I pointed out to them, hey, do you know that EXO stands for exoskeleton? They all looked down at the bars and said, well, at least it tastes good. And we had a laugh. If you go on Amazon and look around, you'll find a ton of stuff made out of insect products. Essentially what they do is they take house crickets, they freeze dry them and then grind them into a powder, and it's an extremely efficient way to put protein into things like cricket brownies, cricket pancake mix, cricket pasta, you name it. I promised I'd talk about pollination a bit more because that's one of the focal points of the book as well. Bees pollinate about 80% of the world's plants, including 90 different food crops. Your cup of coffee or tea in the morning, your chocolate, those things would not exist. Vanilla, for example, without bee pollination. And as I said, 1 out of every 3 bites of food you eat is thanks to bees. And the honeybee is responsible for about $15 billion in U.S. agricultural crops each year. And during the question and answer session, if we have a chance, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about some of the threats that these pollinators face and what we can do to help mitigate those threats. But I want to stop there for now, and thank you very much for listening to me.
Well, thanks for joining us for our community series today, Ted. I really enjoyed the PowerPoint presentation that you put together, found it really informative. And I think the first thing I wanted to ask you about is you identify with enjoying learning about insects from a very young age, starting at the Children's School of Science. And how did that interest change and grow as you changed and grew?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for chatting with me, Liz. So I got my start on this path as an 11-year-old going to the Children's School of Science in Woods Hole. And as the readers of the book will find out, there are many connections between me and the things I'm writing about there. The Woods Hole Children's School of Science, incidentally, was founded by Lillian Sampson, Thomas Hunt Morgan's wife. He was a famous genetic scientist who worked on the fruit fly, Drosophila, but she was also a great entomologist in her own right. And she founded that school, which I later went to as an 11-year-old, as I said, and ended up in an entomology class with local monarch butterfly specialist Becky Lash. And that was where I had my first epiphany about insects, watching a monarch stick its proboscis into a juicy wedge of ripe watermelon and have a long drink. A bunch of us were in a hot classroom on a really warm day, feeling itchy and antsy. And we had quite a lot of sympathy for what that butterfly was doing, taking a long drink. Then sort of throughout my life, I come by all this honestly because my dad is an ecologist and my mom, of course, teaches history and English and taught for a long time at Falmouth Academy and still is very involved in FA life. And so intermingling ecology and history has been my approach to the world, but I've had a number of remarkable interactions with insects in the past. And the second one I talk about in the book is in 2003, I was living in Berkeley, California, and traveled down to Santa Cruz to see the Monarch Migration there. And that was another moment of real revelation for me because I went to a eucalyptus grove and there were literally hundreds of thousands of monarchs sunning themselves on the eucalyptus branches. And that was another moment where I realized, boy, there's something to this. But the last thing I'll mention, the big shift for me was when I was teaching the course I've been doing now for, I guess about 12 years. I was teaching it at Oberlin. It's called Commodities, Nature, and Society. And the students all do final projects on commodities in world history and the ways that they've changed our relationship to the past and the environment. And a student did a project on shellac. And I had never thought about the fact that 78 RPM records, those old brittle records that, you know, it sounds like bacon frying in a fry pan when you listen to that old blues and jazz and classical music on them, were made out of an insect secretion. And in terms of changes in my relationship to the insect world, that was a real revelation, because I'd studied Chinese history and knew about silk, and I'd studied Latin American history and knew quite a bit about cochineal, which I talk about in my lecture. But I had never thought of the third in the trio, shellac. And as a historian, once you have three of anything, you've got enough examples to run with. And so that's where this whole project got its start.
Yeah, that sounds actually very much like a course I would have liked to take as a college student. And your description of your experience with the Monarch sounds really like an otherworldly moment for you. I have a lot of envy, actually. That sounds like something I would love to experience.
And it's an experience I hope my son and future generations will be able to have. Maybe we'll talk about it later, but you know, many insects are in jeopardy. It's something like 40% of the world's insect species are at risk of extinction right now. And so, you know, not to start on a bad note here, but this is, you know, an exhortation, a call to action that we've really got to do something, because some of the experiences that I've had may not be ones that future generations will be able to have. Even something like eating an almond is totally contingent upon insects. Or I'm drinking coffee right now, and that would be impossible without the pollinators that pollinate those plants. So I'm really hoping that others can have those same revelations.
Yeah, and I think that I would like to get there, but I also was interested. I felt like as I was reading, there were multiple points in the book where I had these personal connections that I could feel. And that's one of the things I really liked, you know, as someone who's been living in Woods Hole for some time now. Obviously, I'm familiar with the research institutions that you discuss, but even thinking about, you talked a lot about in New England, the attempts to grow silkworms here. And I didn't know that. And I was thinking about my childhood in Connecticut, trying to imagine silkworm production in my neighborhood. And I couldn't, but I think you do a wonderful job of capturing just how many societies tried to really scale up these commodities. And one of the things I found intriguing is that the three insects that you're most interested in resist that, right? They resist the scaling up. And do you think that that's, you know, for societal benefit, or, you know, what do you make of that?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And one of the things I talk about in the book is this sort of arboreal landscape, the trees or leftovers of trees around the world where people did try to cultivate silkworms, which of course dine on white mulberry leaves. And in the United States, people tried to feed them red mulberry leaves, sometimes to disastrous effect. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it's fascinating. As I was doing the research, the crazy cast of characters involved in these attempts to, as you say, scale up the production of cochineal, silk, and shellac. And in some ways, as you're pointing out, these commodities are resistant to that because they thrive in certain ecological niches, but also demand forms of traditional ecological knowledge that I talk about quite a bit in the book. And you know, the question you're asking also brings up my own relationship to Native studies. I'm very involved in the Native American Indigenous Studies group at the 5 colleges. And one of the things we've been focusing a lot on lately in our conversations is, what does traditional ecological knowledge have to contribute to our understanding of the Anthropocene? And in the case of the 3 insects that the first half of the book discusses, there really are these intimate relationships between long standing cultures and both the botany of raising the plants on which these insects dine and the care that's needed to raise these insects. And a lot of times, part of the problems of the scaling up of these operations were that colonists were really not aware of the depth of that knowledge.
Mhm.
Sometimes, as with the Spanish and cochineal, they just sort of left indigenous production systems alone and said, okay, you do this and we'll exploit you and extract these resources, but didn't mess around. Then in other times, as you're pointing out, there were disastrous attempts, and one of them is Etienne Leopold Trouvelot, who in the 1860s tried to introduce the gypsy moth to Medford, Massachusetts, where he was living as an exile at the time, to strengthen, to make his silkworms more hardy. And then the gypsy moths got away, and many of us know the story that ensues there, which is that gypsy moths love deciduous tree leaves, and they marched up and down the east coast of the United States, eating everything in their path. And so, yeah, as you're pointing out, sometimes when this knowledge was brought beyond these indigenous spheres of long-term production, there were disastrous results. So I hope that begins to answer your question in some way, shape, or form.
I found the sophistication of the techniques that people were using hundreds and hundreds of years ago really astounding. And one of the things which you just touched on is that they recognized already the importance of the relationship between the plants that the insects relied on, and described actually really some very sustainable practices, right? Where you have these small scale productions where plants are cared for, insects are cared for in a very sustainable way. And I was thinking about that and wondering, as humanity is grappling with climate change and issues of sustainability, is that the kind of model that we should be thinking about and looking to history as a way to try and point us in the right direction?
Absolutely. I mean, I think many of these long-term relationships, as you're pointing out, show kind of a different way. Our relationships with insects in general really reflect our approach to the earth right now.
Mm-hmm.
One of the unsustainable relations we have with insects is that we're using a vast array of pesticides, insecticides, and fungicides to perform the task of modern agriculture, and that's not working. It's causing the collapse of many species on which we fundamentally depend. 1 in every 3 bites of food that the average human takes on the planet is pollinated by an insect. And we're doing things that are sort of countervailing approaches to that don't build upon this enormous accumulated wisdom of shellac cultivators in India and silk producers in China and much of the Middle East and cochineal producers in Latin America have shown us needs to exist for planetary health. So yeah, I think there's a lot of didactic potential to the examples I talk about. And one hopes, I mean, there are models emerging of people really trying to do agriculture in ways that would be much more harmonious. When I was living down in Chile doing my doctoral work, I was visiting a lot of really progressive vineyards where people are doing things with polyculture and much more sophisticated organic agriculture, where they would do things like raise beehives right among the vines so that they'd have their pollinators right there for all the crops they were growing. And they were using llama dung and creating closed loops of nutrient cycling that involve insects and other creatures. So yeah, I think there's tremendous potential to look to the past for this enormous reservoir of possible models of sustainability. Not that everything is in the past available to us that might meet these new challenges, but there certainly are there's a lot of latent potential there that is yet untapped.
One of the things that I liked from the beginning of the book, it really resonated for me. It was, you write, it is a characteristic of our era to underestimate the fundamental roles that non-human life forms play in sustaining the biosphere. And that's something that I have believed and try and teach to my students in the environmental science portion of their 9th grade science class. And I think we're at a moment where we can try and change our perception. So what do you think? How could we go about trying to shift our mindset on that?
Well, one of the suggestions I make in the book is both about literal and figurative listening and the attentiveness that's required in this act. And I've been thinking about ways to incorporate that attentiveness of listening to insects and more broadly to non-human life forms into my own parenting of my 7-year-old. We're currently raising silkworms at home. We've put them in a little styrofoam chicken incubator. The eggs have been incubating for 5 days. In 2 more days, or maybe 3 more days, they should hatch. And then we're going to feed them mulberry leaves and watch them grow. And just simply, during the pandemic moment we're in, it's kind of neat to have things to do with kids that get them familiarized with the ways that insects are in our lives in non-harmful fashions. We always think of insects as pests, and, obviously thinking about Lyme disease and deer ticks and mosquitoes and lice is how we are constantly aware of these creatures. But yet there's so much more. And that's what the book tries to suggest. And what I've been trying to suggest with my students is that an attentiveness, we have the time. One of the few silver linings to COVID has been that we have the time to do some of these things. I probably would not have thought of raising silkworms as something I could have incorporated into my daily life before being on lockdown. I'm teaching from home, and I'm at home with a 7-year-old, always trying to figure out how to keep them entertained. And so it's things like this that may make us more aware. The other fun one that I would definitely suggest people try out is next time you're listening to a cricket outdoors, before it gets too cold, of course, try counting its chirps for 14 seconds and then add 40 to that number. And you get a remarkably accurate reading of the outdoor temperature in degrees Fahrenheit. I've been blown away by this. We have a thermometer on the porch, and we've multiple times gotten within, 1 or 2 degrees of the correct temperature. And this is just, for me, these are kind of moments where insects are telling us little things, but I think on a larger scale, insects are telling us a lot more about the health of our planet. And one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is just encourage people to be listening to that, because they're involved at the beginning and the end in kind of closing a lot of loops as the pollinators that facilitate plant sex, frankly, and then at the end as these enormously important organisms in the process of decay of organic matter. And without, once that loop gets broken and is torn asunder, we're in real trouble, because the planet depends upon insects much more than it does on us. And so, just that attentiveness is something I hope I'm working on cultivating, and I hope that the book suggests some possibilities for doing that.
Yeah, and I think children are an excellent opportunity, because I think that the ick factor, right? That's a learned behavior, right?
Yeah.
No child is instinctually grossed out by or afraid of insects.
Absolutely, yeah.
I look at what my son, he's 3.5, and he'll pick up anything, and
Sure.
he'll let spiders crawl across his hand. And my husband and I are, we're also very interested in arachnids and in insects. And so we don't have the ick factor at our house, but I think that that's a great way, great thing to do, is encourage children to explore insects and respect insects, and start to see them as friends and as helpers. That's how we call them at our house. They're friends.
They're friends and helpers. And so, I think you're totally right that the ick factor is culturally contingent. Just as an example of that, I have many Chinese students who've been in my classes and have said how bizarre they think cereal with milk is when they get to the United States. For us, it seems like a natural pairing. It's a lot of propaganda historically by the milk industry to get us to do that pairing, but it's a trained behavior, and it can be unlearned. Safeco Field, where the Seattle Mariners play, has some vending stands now that are selling chapulines, which are roasted crickets with chilies and lime on them. And they've sold several 100,000 servings of the stuff. And, now crickets are occupying a space next to hot dogs and peanuts and Cracker Jacks as part of the baseball park fair. And it may be that it'll take some time for other insects to begin to join both our dining experiences, but also, just our understandings of the world around us, and maybe more peaceful ways that will take time. But you're right that it really is learned behavior, and it's cultural rather than something that's biological and fixed in human nature.
And for our children and other children, I think it's really critical. I think we're at a point where we need to start considering the future of the earth, right? And as you said, that the earth depends a lot more on insects than it does on us. And some of the data becoming available about the threats to pollinators in particular are really frightening to me as an educator and as a parent. And so I think your book is it's really important that that message is getting into the culture, because we do need to be considering what is the world going to look like in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 100 years. And the things we do now will set our trajectory. And hopefully we're having a future where insects are doing well, because we're going to need them.
I hope so. I mean, it's one of the challenges of doing environmental history is to not make everything sort of a 1-800-CRY-DOOM scenario, and to have messages of hope and encouragement for my students, but also to be realistic about the threats we face and what we need to do immediately. I mean, people really need to support on the large scale politicians and legislation that protects habitats and works to combat climate change, but also works to ban the chemicals that are wreaking havoc on not only insect populations, but our environment and food supply in general. Then at the more sort of local level, I mean, in our neighborhood, a number of people have been doing things like planting plants that are friendly to insects.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, monarch butterfly happened to really like milkweed. And so some people were planting milkweed in their front yard, and it turns out that monarchs are very happy to lay their eggs there. And you know, so there are little things that you can do, but we also need to operate on broader scales, you know, and with elections coming up, people need to be thinking about that suite of issues as well. And it has to be on the radar now. It's part of politics is you know, putting the environment as a centerpiece.
I've also noticed around Falmouth as well, even here at school, a lot more of these pollinator gardens. Here at school, just actually outside the library, is a terrific garden with the kinds of flowers that attract bees and butterflies. And we were just out there last week, one sunny day, having lunch, and the activity of the honeybees and other pollinators was just amazing. You know, you can sit there and there are tens, if not hundreds, of insects there, moving from flower to flower.
And that's great for kids to see in part two, because, you know, to understand where the stuff on your plate comes from, you need to have a much fuller picture of all the loops and cycles and organisms involved in that production. We think of, you know, sort of these giant monoculture farms out in the Midwest producing heap loads of soybeans and corn or whatever, and that's part of the picture, but there's so much else going on. And so if you can make that tangible in some way, like a pollinator garden or getting kids involved in interacting with insects, that I think goes a long way towards building out the next generation's awareness of what issues we face.
And then those kids are going to become the ones who are voting and making these bigger decisions and making decisions that protect those organisms.
I mean, you know, this is a lot of fun to talk about, and I hope in some measure, you know, the book opens up some doors to people who've thought about a lot of ink has been spilled for good reason on the other side of the equation, which is, you know, the disastrous impacts that insects have had on human history. And that's there, and I acknowledge it at the very beginning. You know, malaria, Zika, dengue fever, West Nile virus, you can just go on and on. You know, in the Pioneer Valley here where I live, we have Eastern equine encephalitis. And these are certainly realities. Farmers spend upwards of $16 billion US dollars a year globally combating insect pests. But I wanted to weigh in that there's this enormous other side to the story that that needs to be considered and talked about somehow, because you know, insects have gotten a bad rap, sometimes for good reason, but there's more to it than that.
Right. And I think that you know, is a nice transition a little bit into the impact of climate change on these organisms. Because one of the things that's happening as a result of climate change, for example, is that the range of the mosquito is changing, and that means that the range of malaria is changing as a result, or things like Zika. But along with the changes to those insects that are contributing harm to humans, we're negatively affecting the insects that are helping us as well.
Yeah, and the migration of a number of the plant species on which the insects I talk about in the beginning of the book dine is also sort of one of the results of that. The range of the fig and acacia trees on which shellac is raised, for example, is changing because some of them are simply not drought tolerant. And so some of the bands in which that cultivation has occurred historically are becoming impossible for, a lot of especially women in developing countries depend upon the extra income that these cottage industries supply. Non-timber forest products have been looked at for a long time by progressive environmental thinkers as one of the routes through which, men and women in rural areas get access to income, and climate change is really altering that balance, and that's going to have extreme downstream economic effects on these communities, but also just habitat destruction and its relationship to climate change, and insects as indicators of that. If you look at what's going on in Brazil and throughout much of the developed and developing worlds, it's the habitat destruction that's both a cause of and a product of climate change as a driver for it that are going to have really enormous effects. We've got to work very conscientiously right now at these tipping points to get this under control. So I hope the political will is there, but certainly the insects have a message to tell us, and I try at the end of the book to suggest the way, and attentiveness to those messages is absolutely crucial right now.
And I think that the attentiveness is really important. I like thinking about insects because I think that they make me remember and appreciate that the earth is such a series of connected cycles where, like the title, right, the butterfly effect, you change one thing, and we talk about this in my class, right? We make one change, and what happens as a result, what will result. And I think our attentiveness will help us to conceptualize that, deeper, and also then allow us to spread that to other people and hopefully, begin some movement in a positive direction.
Yeah. One of the fun and surprising things doing the research for the book, which I discussed a little bit in my talk, was becoming attentive to the stories that I knew absolutely nothing about people who had been doing this listening historically. Like I discussed Maria Sibylla Merian and Charles Henry Turner at quite some length, because both of their stories for me highlighted some of the gaps in my own knowledge. I knew very little about Merian, who's this 17th century entomologist and enormously talented painter who crossed the Atlantic, went to Dutch Suriname with her daughter in 1699 and revolutionized the way we study insects. And so some of the attentiveness to insects was also, as a historian, learning these stories, or Charles Henry Turner, who was the first African-American published in Science and did remarkable work on bee pollinators with no lab, no grad students. He wasn't able to get a university job because he was Black, and he was an enormously talented teacher, and as a high school teacher just did all his experiments in a park in St. Louis, Missouri. And so one of the interesting things about insects that I'm still playing around with in my mind is, there's something almost a bit more democratic about the way they get studied.
Mm-hmm.
Because there obviously are studies of insects that use tremendously complicated laboratory equipment and facilities and institutions, but some of the really revolutionary work on insects historically was done by just people out in the field, like observing and again listening and being really attentive. And so that has kind of piqued my curiosity about, is there something kind of special about the world of studying insects that has a kind of field component that is still not entirely contingent upon multi-billion-dollar institutions.
Right.
No.
You don't need a mass spectrometer necessarily, or some of these really fancy pieces of equipment.
Yeah.
It can be a lot more equitable.
Yeah, and I think the other individual I talk about pairing him with Charles Henry Turner is Karl von Fritsch, who was a man of Jewish descent who was mercilessly persecuted by the Nazis, who gave us much of the rest of our understanding in the 1930s of the way that bees found nectar and pollinated flowers. And he was beset by just really oppressive political circumstances because his grandmother was Jewish, and he employed a lot of Jewish women in his laboratories, and the Nazis were after him at every turn. But he persevered, like Turner, and did so by he was out in the mountains all the time watching bees and studying their hives. And there's something kind of inspiring about the innovators of the field, that they were just really committed to being out in the world with their bugs.
Well, are there any other comments or anything else that you wanted to touch on at this point?
We've covered a lot, and this has been wonderful. I've had a lot of fun. I do want to just say one very brief thing to thank FA, and especially Alison Ament, who did so much to shape me as a scientist. So I want to make sure to thank Alison.
Yeah, I should also thank Alison, because my first couple of years here, she helped shape me quite a bit as well, and was a great source of information and wisdom and guidance.
Yeah, and she mentored me through countless science fair projects. She actually let me do an independent entomology study. We had been living in Washington, D.C. during 7th and 8th grade, and I came back to FA, and she let me do this independent study, which again, in terms of thinking about the formative stages of my own approach to this, was crucial. So just a word of thanks to her.
Well, I've had a lot of fun, and thank you so much for coming and taking your time to participate in our community series.
Thanks so much, Liz. And thanks to Barbara Campbell and George Shar for their organizational work on this as well.
Thanks, everyone.